The application now allows us to list, insert, update and delete employees, but there really is no security and everyone can do these functions. So in the following videos, we will wire ASP.NET Core Identity to our application to perform user authentication and authorization. ASP.NET Core Identity is a membership framework that provides authentication and authorization services for our application. So we will be able to perform tasks such as creating a new user account and signing in and signing out of the application. The user data is typically stored in an SQL Server database, and ASP.NET Core Identity also supports external login providers such as Facebook, Twitter, and Microsoft accounts. But as far as our application is concerned, we will store the data in our SQL Server database. Now, in order to implement authentication and authorization, the system needs to deal with users and roles. Therefore, the Employee Manager application needs to have classes that represent the application's users and roles respectively. And these classes will allow us to capture user and role details. So let's create these classes first. So in the Employee Manager application, I'm going to add another folder, and I'll call this one Security. And in this folder we will have three classes. We will have a class for the identity user, the identity role, and also for the identity DB context. So let's add the identity user class. So I'm going to add another class here, and I'm going to call this one APP for Application Identity User. Now, in order to make this an identity user class, it needs to inherit from the identity user class. So we'll do the inheritance from the identity user. It's underlined, that means we need to bring in the namespace, which is in the ASP.NET Core.Identity. And for our user, we only need really two things, and that is the name, and let's say also birthday. So let's create properties for those. So the first one is gonna be a string, and this is gonna be for the name. I'll call this one full name. And then is another property for the birth date. So this is gonna be date time, and I'll call it birth date. And that's all. That is our user. That's all we need for our application. Now we need to create a class for the identity role. So in the security folder, I'm going to add a class, and I'll call this one app identity role. And to make it an identity role class, it needs to inherit from the identity role. And for our roles, we really need only one thing, and that is the description of the role. So this is gonna be a property of type string, and I'll call it description. And that is our class. Very, very simple. And finally, we're going to add an identity DB context. We have a DB context for our employee manager, so we have the DB set for our employee class. However, we will have a different context for the identity. So in the security folder, I'm going to add a class. I'll call this one app identity DB context. And this is similar to what we did in our regular app DB context. When I open it, we have the constructor that passes in the DB context options. Now for our identity, we are going to be working with the identity object, so we want the identity user as well as the identity role in our DB context. So in our app identity DB context, I'm going to inherit from the identity DB context. And you can see this is underlined, and that's because we need to bring in not a namespace, but we actually need to install a package. So we can install it right from here. We can install the package Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity Framework Core, or we can go to the packager and install a nugget. Either way would work just fine. So I'll actually go and select install with package manager. So it brings me to the package manager, and I can just browse for it. And here it is, Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity Framework Core. Now currently it's telling me that the latest stable version is 3.1.8. However, this version was actually just available starting today, and I started this course a few days ago, so the packages I installed for my Entity Framework Core are actually 3.1.7. So I'll choose the same version for my Identity Framework Core as I have for the Entity Framework Core itself. Otherwise it would be a mismatch. Let me just show you. I'll try to install the latest stable version 3.1.8 while my Microsoft Entity Framework Core that I have installed is 3.1.7. So I'll click install, and you can see the first error is about the identity DB context that's in my code. Let me just show you quickly what I'm talking about. That's just this line that I'm trying to inherit from identity DB context before I installed it. So I'll just delete it from the code. Let's go back to the Nugget package manager and let's try to install it again. But I still get errors, and it says that the detected package downgrade Microsoft Entity Framework Core from 3.1.8 to 3.1.7. So the versions need to match. So I'm just going to install the 3.1.7 for my identity, just so it matches my Entity Framework Core. I'll click install, accept, and now everything is okay. So when you are installing it, just make sure that your identity version matches the Framework Core version. Alright, so let's go back to the app identity DB context. I'm going to bring back the inheritance from the identity DB context because now it's available. So all I have to do now is to bring in the namespace, which is the identity.entity framework core. Now, so I'm inheriting from identity DB context, but I want to specify that this is for the user as well as the role. So the first one is our app identity user. That's the class we created. And the second one is the app identity role. Now it expects 3 arguments, and the third one is basically just a string. This is the primary key for users and roles, and we have it as a string. So I'll type string. So this is our app identity DB context class that inherits from identity DB context, and it injects it into our classes for the app identity user and the app identity role. Now let's create a constructor. And just like with the regular DB context, we only have the empty constructor that passes the options into the base. We're gonna do something similar for our identity. We are going to pass the DB context options, and this is for our app identity DB context. And I'll call it options. And just like before, we will simply pass everything back to the base class. So we'll do the base and pass in the options. And there is no code here, just like it is not any code there for our app DB context. So again, this is pretty much the same empty constructor, except this one refers to the app identity DB context for our identity DB context object. So next, let's configure our application to accept the authorization and authentication.